Welcome to 360 Money Matters, where financial planners Billy and Andrew talk all things financial planning. This podcast aims to increase your knowledge and confidence with all things money. Each week, they will cover topics like wealth creation strategies, investment principles, creating passive income, paying off your debt faster, and much, much more, so you can live a life on your terms without limits.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our podcast with Billy and Andrew. Andrew, how are you?
Welcome back. Yes, I'm good, Billy. All is going well despite the current lockdown restrictions in Melbourne, but that's all right.
We'll keep on keeping on. So hopefully this one brings a little bit of joy and excitement to our listeners. But today we're talking about developing an investment strategy.
Yeah, this is the exciting one, Billy. This is what all of our listeners have been writing in. They want to hear more about, investments. Nah, I'm just kidding. No one's been writing in. It was just my mum. But no, this is really the exciting one. This is the juicy one. This is one most people see in financial advisor, sort of in my experience, Bills. But yeah, we're talking about developing an investment strategy today. So yeah, tell us, Billy, what are we talking about? What's an investment strategy? How do we start going about it?
So just before we jump into that, so this is step 4 in our 6-step process. Yep. And this the whole range of different financial planning topics and the journey that we take clients on when we're talking to them about their financial circumstances. So this is the 4th one in a series of 6 steps that we take them through.
Yeah, so if you're just jumping in now, make sure that you go back to step 1, because that's where it all begins and that sets you on the right track for really developing an effective investment strategy.
So let's get straight into it. Investment strategy. So this is, I think when people start to think about an investment strategy, straight away people are going to investment products. And everybody has heard of the different investment products. And I guess the main ones that stand out that we come across when we're talking to clients is things like shares and property. They're probably the 2 biggest ones. But from our perspective, you don't go to that position just yet. You talk about those things later on. It's actually developing sort of a high-level overview about what you're trying to achieve with your wealth creation. And then there's so many different layers to that, unpacking the goals, figuring out where it is and what our clients actually want to achieve, and then putting a plan and a strategy together in place first before we even start talking about products or even thinking about those particular things.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, trying to find the right product or the right investment to invest in, it all depends on what your goals are. It all depends on what you're trying to achieve from those investments. I mean, if you're trying to pay for kids' education, for instance, and that's expected to happen in, 5 or 10 years' time, maybe buying an investment property is not the best way to fund that. Maybe there's other ways in order to do it. So having a clear understanding of, what am I trying to do? Am I trying to build assets for retirement? Am I trying to have an annual holiday? Am I trying to leave something behind for the next generation? The goal is absolutely the most important thing to start with. And once that's been developed, then you can sort of pick and choose the strategy and match the investment products off the back of that.
Yeah, so really understanding what it is that client wants to achieve. So what is their goals? Understanding what their position is, and we take them through that. And we spoke about a little bit about that in our previous steps. And then figuring out, I guess, timeframes is also a really critical one as well too, because some timeframes are short in nature, long in nature, and medium term in nature. So we need to make sure that we've got the right timeframe set correctly to match the asset that we're picking or the investment strategy that we're developing in order to achieve what it is that they want over that particular time frame. So starting essentially with the end in mind and then working backwards.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And then, once you've got a good understanding of that and sort of what you're trying to achieve, I guess one of the biggest things is how do you own the assets? How do you do it, Bills? What do you do? What structure do you actually own your investments in?
There's a whole range of different areas or different ways that you can own a particular asset. There's no right or wrong. So unfortunately for our listeners, there's no particular golden bullet here. Once again, it really depends on your particular circumstances. But you can own assets individually. You can own assets through trust structures. You can own assets through companies, superannuation funds, a whole range of different areas. And all of those things have their pros and cons associated with different structures, from tax incentives for holding things with CGT, concessions, to asset protection, which we'll cover a little bit further along when we're talking about estate planning in step 6. But unfortunately, there's no right or wrong answer. It really is dependent on people's circumstances. And sort of getting into the next topic about acquiring the asset, thinking about something like your cash position and where you hold cash. So we talk about superannuation, and a lot of people have money in their super. You see people are opening up SMSFs using the money that they've got in there to buy investment properties. That's just an example of being able to have an asset that can buy a particular type of asset through your superannuation fund.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, each structure and everything that you're trying to do, or sort of, as we've been banging on for the last 5 minutes about, depends on what you're trying to achieve. Look, superannuation is one asset that's a really great asset class, and it's great really for the tax incentives and the tax benefits associated with it. But if you're 35 and you're trying to retire in 10 years' time, well, you're probably not going to be able to access your superannuation until a decent time away. And so that may not be the best way to hold all of your assets or the bulk of your assets. So really determining what you're trying to achieve will help us as financial advisors guide our clients on where to hold your assets. Do you hold all of it in one asset or in one ownership structure? Do you put absolutely everything through a trust, or do you hold everything individually, or do you do a combination of some assets in superannuation, some assets outside of superannuation, and finding that real balance to really be able to accelerate your wealth creation?
I think if you're sitting in front of a financial planner, Andrew, that's something that is going to get flushed out as part of that. So It's not like you need to engage with this process or engage with a planner and actually know what that is. That will come out in the process when we're discovering goals, when we're having conversations about your circumstances, what it is that you want to achieve and where you're heading as well too.
Absolutely. And that sort of brings us to the next thing, which is, which assets do you really acquire and how do you acquire these assets? Take us through a build. I know it's a bit of an open-ended question.
There's a fair bit there's a fair bit to unpack, and similar to sort of what I said last time around there's no correct structure to own a particular asset. Once again, there's a whole range of different things you need to take into consideration when you're thinking about what type of assets to acquire, and in particular when you want to acquire them as well too. Some assets, the barriers to entry are quite small. So if you want to be able to buy some shares, you just need some money in the bank. You pay a small fee to a brokerage firm or your online brokerage fee. They're fairly cheap. Click of a few buttons and away you go. You've bought an asset. Whereas you think of a particular asset that takes a long time to get into, say something like property, Andrew, where you need to save up your deposit, you need to get your lending in place. By the time you purchase that and settle on it, that can take some time. And there's a whole range of different things that you need to take into consideration. You're talking about cash flow. So an asset that you're buying like a property, you need to take the cash flow into consideration because you need the income coming off that to help support the debt that you've got. Thinking about things like accessibility. So if you are buying a longer term asset and your circumstances change and you need to back out of that position and you need to sell it, if you're doing it in a short time frame, all of those costs that you've sunken in at the start, they're probably going to get lost and you're not going to be able to recoup your money. Things like liquidity as well too. So if you're buying, say, a share portfolio and your car blows up and you need to buy a car, you can snap off a portion of your shares to be able to buy that other car. But if you had a property, you can't necessarily sell a bedroom or the driveway or anything like that. So a whole range of things to consider from that perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the key. Having a time frame and having a pretty decent idea on how long you're going to hold an asset for is imperative in deciding what you're going to buy. If the expectation is that you're going to sell an asset within a few years, then if you're considering to purchase an investment property and you're not developing or you're not adding some equity via your own sort of blood, sweat, tears or money to it, then maybe it's not a good idea to purchase that asset and sell it within a few years once you take into consideration the stamp duty costs that are associated with it and any potential capital gains. It's all about how long are you going to hold an asset for and when is the expected time frame to liquidate that asset. And we see it all the time. I say expected, and that's very much used methodically because you never know what's around the corner and you never know what's going to change from your own circumstances. So things can change and investment strategy will change, but you sort of need to plan for it a little bit in advance and anticipate some changes as well.
Yeah, you're right, Andrew. Look, it's a little bit of science and a little bit of art sort of mixed in together because you're trying to plan all of these things. And let's face it, we know that life doesn't always go according to plan. So you have to have some contingencies in place and you have to have some flexibility with it. And any good investment strategy that gets put together takes all of those elements into consideration and should be flexible enough to be able to change and pivot direction as and when things occur. But that's a really good conduit into sort of the next part of what we wanted to talk about today was how are we acquiring these assets, and a couple of ways to do it. But, we talk about using debt, and in particular in this environment that we're in where money is ridiculously cheap and it's very, very accessible.
Cheaper than it's ever been.
Yeah, it's one of those things that constantly comes up. And how do we acquire these assets, Andrew? Debt, cash, combination of both? What are we looking at?
Yeah, look, there's really a few ways or a combination of two ways that you can acquire assets. And one is with cash, so money that you have in savings that you put towards your investments. And the other way is by way of debt. And that's the most common of which is taking out a debt in order to purchase a property. There are some instances where you can do, a combination of both. There are instances where you can acquire debt without necessarily just an investment property, namely a margin loan, taking debt against a portfolio of shares or managed funds. There's also utilizing a combination of both. And look, in the last podcast, we spoke all about debt management. So this sounds a little bit counterintuitive or counter to what we were talking about, which was getting your debts under control. But as Billy will sort of talk through now, debt can be a really powerful tool when you're growing your wealth and when you're utilizing it for a real proper purpose and you're taking good debt as opposed to bad debt.
And, let's face it, everybody's, particularly here in Australia where property seems to be our national sport, but everybody's heard the story. Everyone's got an uncle or a grandparent that's bought that property back in 1980 and bought it for, $70,000 and now it's worth $2 million. And everyone's heard that story. We're in a different environment today because property is a lot harder to get into. The debt and the income associated with servicing a large property purchase in particular can get quite expensive. And, if you want to buy a property worth $1.5 million and you're taking out a substantial mortgage, then you're going to need the income to be able to service that. Ultimately, what it all comes down to is, like we've been highlighting, individual circumstances based on what you've got, what your goals are, and where it is that you're going, and tailoring a strategy that works to your circumstances, because there's no right or wrong. There's a couple of common themes that we talk about when we're thinking about debt in particular. Just by our very nature, we want to be as conservative as possible and try and put some risk mitigation strategies in play. We don't want to make sure that people are over-leveraged or overstretched. If they do take on debt, you need to be able to service that debt. And not only in this interest rate environment as well, too, where we're getting home loan rates down to the low twos. Sometimes we're getting it with a 1 in front of it if it's a fixed rate rather than a variable. But we want to make sure that if we are advising clients to take a particular course of action, that they can hold that particular asset and service that particular debt moving forward in the years to come as well, too. So when we're looking at it, it's different for everybody's circumstances, but we definitely do it from a conservative perspective. And one of the other things that I think is relevant is talking to some of our younger clients who have seen their parents maybe get into their family home right from the get-go when they first bought property. Andrew, maybe if you want to shed some light on taking a more of a stepped approach, so getting into maybe not your family home or not that great asset that you want, but doing it in stages.
Yeah, absolutely. Your investment journey and everyone's investment journey is completely different, but most people think I need to save up as much money as I can, save all of that money, put that into an owner-occupied property, and that's it, and then pay down that debt. That's what historically a lot of people have done. And if you acquire a couple of properties along the way and you acquire a few more assets along the way, then great, you've done pretty well for yourself. But it doesn't have to be in that order, and it doesn't have to be exactly like that. We've seen a number of clients that the owner-occupied property is not the first asset that they acquire. They acquire to smaller bite-sized investments. Investments in managed funds, in shares, in alternative assets, and they rent where they live. And that's a perfectly great example of how you can utilize the cash flow that you have to invest and grow at a rate of return higher than what your savings rate is, that can either sit alongside an owner-occupied property that you purchase in the future, or you can liquidate in order to purchase an owner-occupied property in the future. So replacing one asset with another asset.
Yeah, perfect, Andrew. There's some real juicy stuff in that. And I think the key message there is just because you can't do, or you may not be in a position to be able to do everything all in one go, there are other solutions there. And I think that's a really powerful message to get across to our listeners. And hopefully for those of you out there that are thinking about that the circumstances or the environment is too difficult or too challenging, there's definitely a way around it and through it. And we have these conversations and talk through it day in, day out with our clients, and we see it working quite successfully. So yeah, really good message from that perspective, Andrew. And you did touch on cash flow as well, which sort of brings us to the next point that we wanted to talk about was with an investment asset, particularly the holding costs associated with it, and I guess a little bit around the cash flow piece. And can you afford to hold a particular type of asset? Is it throwing off the right income? Is it throwing off the right yield? That becomes a bigger consideration when we're talking about debt and things like that. But do you want to talk us through a little bit about that in some more detail, Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, it's really common, and a lot of people, it's almost impossible these days, but for a lot of people, purchasing an investment property or their first sort of reason to purchase an investment property is, I want it to be negatively geared. I want to have a negatively geared property and claim a tax deduction on it every year.
It's all about the tax, man, isn't it?
Oh, look, we all reduce tax, and I'm definitely not saying that that's a bad strategy. I mean, albeit with interest rates being as low as what they are now, it's very difficult to have a negatively geared property. But getting an understanding on what does that actually mean? I mean, a negatively geared property, it means that the interest that you're paying on the mortgage on that property or your expenses against that property are more than what you're getting in rental income. So you're claiming a loss on it, which is great from a tax perspective. But from a cash flow perspective, it means that you need to put money towards that property every single year, as opposed to a positively geared property where the rental income is higher than all of the costs associated with interest and holding costs on that property. So yeah, you pay a little bit of tax, but you're actually making a profit on it year on year. There's no right or wrong, and it all depends on the strategy, because you can have a positively geared property that works fantastic for certain individuals. And yes, it means paying a little bit of tax, but from a wealth creation perspective, it definitely makes sense. But you can also have a negatively geared property that's given you a tax deduction that grows in value every year. So even though you might lose a little bit from a cash flow perspective, you're claiming a tax deduction and having the ability for the asset to grow. So determining what it is that you're trying to achieve or how it fits into the overall picture of your wealth creation is sort of the most important thing as to which way you go about it. But yeah, making sure that you can hold a property, making sure that you can, as you touched on earlier, what happens if interest rates go up? What happens if you lose your job? What happens if and we'll talk a little bit more about that in sort of the next podcast, but making sure that from a cash flow perspective, if things don't go to plan, it doesn't mean all the balls are up in the air and you sort of need to go on this fire sale to try and get rid of all your assets in order to cover your debts.
Yeah, 100%, Andrew. And that comes back to having a really solid investment strategy that takes all of these things into consideration. So one of the things that we do regularly when we're putting an investment strategy together, and you would have heard the term about diversification and not putting all of your eggs in one basket. Same sort of thing from this perspective. We don't like to use a client's all of their cash reserves in order to get into a particular asset for an investment strategy. And that's simply because we don't want to be in a position where if something does not necessarily goes wrong, but if something goes wrong or if circumstances change, as they always do, we don't want to have to reverse that position and exit an investment, prematurely, because there can be costs associated with that. So when you're developing an investment strategy, all of these things should be taken into consideration, that the sort of what if planning that sits around that. And like I said, any good investment strategy should take that into account as well too. One of the other things that's a really interesting point that we need to discuss is, when do we sell these particular assets? When do we liquidate them? Is it just that, hey, we buy and hold forever? Is that the strategy, or is there particular points in time when we've made enough money out of it and we want to exit that position? What does that look like from your perspective, Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, it all needs to link back to the goal. And it's really important to actually have this as a part of your investment strategy. Have the point in time in which you exit. And exit doesn't necessarily mean that you sell that asset. That doesn't always have to be the case from an exit perspective. But making sure that you know when enough is enough. You also, as much as, we're big proponents on growing your wealth, expanding your wealth, doing as much as you can to really make sure that you have enough money, not only for yourself, but for all of the other things that you want, your family, your next generation, all of that stuff, making sure that you know when enough is enough. Because the last thing that you want to be doing is working until you're 75, which is only a couple of years away for Billy.
I was waiting for that. Thank you, Andrew.
But the last thing that you want to be doing is working, to the bone up until, touch wood, the day that you pass away without having enjoyed all of the assets. So making sure that there's a point in time which you say, I've grown enough of my wealth, I've got enough money to sufficiently last me for all of the things that I want in my lifetime and everything that I want for the next generation in the beneficiaries that I'm passing my assets on to. So you know when to have enough. And have enough, as I said, doesn't need to be just selling your assets. I mean, one of the really big things and one of the sort of most important things for most assets is passive income. It's talked about a lot. So you don't need to sell your assets in order to make what you've grown with it. You also want to be able to deliver a passive income out of it. So tell us, what's a passive income? What does that mean?
So yeah, thinking about that, and just for the record, let's just backtrack a little bit. I'm 41 years young, so just let's put that on the record and get that out there. Look, passive income, interesting enough, the way that we tend to talk through it with people, I mean, it's very difficult of a concept for a lot of people to put a number around, and that's simply because you need to cast your mind forward to a point in time where you don't have to work to derive an income the same way that the majority of people do now. You think about passive income where it's something that comes in without you needing to exert any physical exertion, and it just comes in and you've got the choice. I wouldn't say that you have to, because everybody's idea of what the future looks like is different, but you've got the choice whether or not you want to work. And in that instance, one of the ways that we describe it to people and get them in that headspace is in the event where you didn't have to work and you had money coming in from your investments and that was happening in the background while you slept passively, how much money would you need to live? And that's always a challenging one because, you know, a lot of people complain about work and the 9 to 5 and the 40-hour weeks and all of that sort of stuff. But the truth is, if we didn't have that, what would we actually replace that time with? And people start to think about their hobbies and traveling and spending time with loved ones and family and friends. A lot of those things cost money. So not only have you got all of your week back, but you've got this whole amount of time where you can actually spend a lot more money than what you probably could during your normal working week. One of the ways that we tend to think about this and get people in that headspace is we start to talk about what their income is at the moment and start to think about passive income as a percentage of what their income is at the moment, because that's what people can kind of relate to and that's what people tend to need in order to live the lifestyle that they're living at that particular point in time. So from a passive income perspective, what we aim to do is build an investment strategy across a range of different assets to try and yield enough of an income where we're replacing, I guess, someone's salary, essentially, right, Andrew?
Yeah, look, absolutely. And the other part of this, which forms part of or is an integral part to any investment strategy, is you want to make sure that the assets that you're relying on from a passive income perspective are the assets that are going to deliver the most for you from a passive income perspective. So what I'm sort of trying to say is if you've got a property, I mean, historically, the rental yields and the rental income on property is not always the best asset class from a passive income perspective. Great from a capital growth, but unless you sell it or unless you decide to liquidate that asset, it doesn't necessarily yield a great form of passive income. So you want to make sure that once you're entering into a phase where you're starting to rely on passive income, you want to make sure that you've got the assets that are delivering the most for you and are held in the right structure. I mean, after the age of 65, or even sometimes after the age of 60, superannuation can form a passive income without having to pay tax on. So there's nuances within the strategy to make sure that you're holding the right assets and in the right structure to make sure that you're maximizing the passive income as much as possible.
Well said, Andrew. Well said. Now, let's do a bit of a dive into the different assets that you can hold. So some of these will sound familiar to a lot of our listeners, but we talk about things like, you know, we've spoken about shares today, we've spoken about property, managed funds, there's infrastructure, bonds, fixed income. Andrew, over to you.
Yeah, I'm surprised that there's anything other than property and shares. I thought that was it, really.
For most people, you're absolutely right. I mean, for most people, that's where it sits, and I guess that's the sphere that you tend to know, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, they're the things that you see absolutely every single day. People are talking about shares, people are talking about property, but that's not it. That's not the only thing that you can have from an investment perspective. And even when you're talking about shares and property, they're not the only types of, or the historical, thought bubble around shares and property. They're not the only shares and property assets that you can invest in. I mean, for instance, you can invest in a fund that invests in property on your behalf without having to purchase a physical property, without having to take on a mortgage, or without having to put $1 million into an asset class. You can invest with $10 or $100. So even when you're thinking about historical assets and the way of investing that most people know about, there are differences within those asset classes. I mean, you can invest in shares without having to buy one specific stock. You can invest through a fund that has exposure to multiple different, or hundreds, if not thousands, of stocks. So there's absolutely more investments out there. There's more vehicles out there. There's more, out there than what most people think.
Yeah, and I think the key with all of this is, because you can get lost in all of this stuff, I think the key from our perspective, and when we're delivering advice to our clients and when we're constructing portfolios and putting a strategy together, the thing that we try and achieve, and you would have heard the term about diversification before, is we try and diversify people's holdings across a range of different asset types. And that's simply because, one, we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, and two, you would have heard the saying, but if we've got all of our eggs in one basket, I sound like a big cliche here, Andrew, but if you've got all your eggs in one basket and something happens to that particular asset class, it really can spell disaster for a client. And in terms of their wealth creation, it actually does the opposite. It can be quite destructive. Take, for argument's sake, if you've got all of your money in the share market and you experience a share market correction or a share market crash, it can be quite detrimental. But if you've got 20% or 25% of your wealth tied up in the share market, only a portion of your portfolio is impacted by that. So when we're constructing an investment strategy and putting portfolios together, diversification is really at the heart of what we do. And that's more so a risk mitigation strategy, but any good investment strategy should take that into consideration.
Yeah, absolutely. And as Billy was saying, there's diversification to help reduce your risk. There's having nuances within the actual investment. So do you put everything in Australian investments? Do you put a portion of it in international investments? Once you sort of start looking outside of shares and property, do you have money in infrastructure? So your roads, your tollways, your airports, your gas lines. Do you have some money in bonds, whether that's corporate bonds, whether that's government bonds, whether that's, in Australia, outside of Australia? Having a portfolio that's diversified across multiple asset classes really just helps reduce the risk. And even within it, I mean, do you hold some of your assets in blue chip companies that to some degree a little bit more stable, and then a portion of it in some smaller caps that have exposure to growth, but you take on a little bit more risk and hold a smaller proportion in there? It's all around having the right strategy, holding the right assets, and all of that working towards the one, or not just one, but the multiple goals that you have from your investments. So there's so many different options out there. And I think the thing, for me personally, that I really, as an advisor, strive to get across to clients is it's not just about shares and property. There's so many more options out there. There are ways to mitigate risk, and finding the right one for you is different for every single person and every single strategy.
Yeah, and it's a challenging, looking at it from an outsider's perspective, it is easy to get confused. And the problem is there is so much out there. There's industry jargon as well too that makes it difficult. So you tend to gravitate, I think, towards more so those shares and property. But you're right, when we are giving advice to clients, we're really guiding them through that process to give them confidence that all of these elements are crucial to take into consideration when we're putting an investment strategy in play, and also taking them through sort of an education process as well too, to understand all of the different elements and the different asset classes that we talk to clients about how an investment strategy should look when we're structuring that to achieve a certain goal based on the client's circumstances. And I guess probably the last part of any decent investment strategy is the constant reviews and the adjustments that we need to make along the way.
Yeah. Any investment strategy has sort of, we have a saying, and I don't know whether it sort of gives you more confidence or less, but any investment strategy has one certainty. And that certainty is that it will change. There's very few circumstances whereby what you do today is the best thing to do in 10 years' time. It happens sometimes, and that's fantastic, but you need to adjust the strategy, and that needs to be adjusted. Most people think about the change in the investment market, but there's also, changes in your own circumstances that will impact the strategy and making sure that it's still on track to meet all of your goals. And have your goals changed? That's an important thing to review. Like, if your goals have changed, then what you're trying to achieve and the assets that you're investing will also change.
Well said, Andrew. Well said, and completely agree with everything that you've spoken about and what we've discussed today. And this is what we talk to clients about day in, day out when we are giving them advice around this. And it's not an easy thing to put an investment strategy together. The other thing that we haven't spoken about as well too, that sits over the top of all of this, is the emotional aspect that sits in it as well too. It's very, very easy to get, especially when it's your money and you're watching it going up and down and sideways and all of the fun stuff that happens. But when you're emotionally invested, it's very, very easy. And we see it time and time again when we're talking to clients and giving them advice. It's very easy to get emotionally invested. And unfortunately, what that leads to is people make some really bad and really dumb decisions when they're emotionally invested. And it's investing, regardless of the asset class, can feel like a roller coaster. And we see it time and time again when people are feeling good about the investments that they make. They want to put more money in. When the investment market's a little bit more volatile and things are going down, people want to withdraw money. And half the time, that's the opposite of what you should be doing.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. That's bang on, exactly the right thing to do. And I think that for me is one of the most valuable pieces of advice that I provide my clients on. And it's really around controlling your emotions and having a professional there to be able to look at things unbiased without any emotional input on the investments. It all too often becomes very easy to get worried about what's happening and sell out, and you're selling at the bottom, and it becomes very easy to become overexcited when things are going well. And having a third party there to be able to look at things from an outsider's perspective makes a very important impact. And it's really also about, when you're developing this strategy, or when you're deciding on what you invest in, one of the ways to kind of not run into these issues is make sure that you're comfortable in whatever you're doing. It doesn't pass the sleep test. If you can't sleep at night, if you're worrying about your investments, at the time that you're entering into those investments, what's going to happen if things turn the other way? What's going to happen if the market starts going down when you're already worried about it before you've even entered? A lot of the times that means that, you're selling out and it may not be the right time to do so. So making sure that whatever you're doing, you're comfortable with, and it really meets those comfort levels.
Completely agree, and well said, Andrew. And that sort of brings us to the end of the investment strategy discussion. And just to summarize, folks, that there's a lot to unpack in here, but we obviously engage with people to talk about their goals, their circumstances. You're looking at different ownership structures. Are there income and cash flow requirements? What's the timing of when you should acquire an asset and discharge an asset? What's the time frame of the asset, the length of the time frame that you're going to hold it for? Different types of assets, the emotional aspect that we spoke about. I think all of this paints a clear picture from my perspective. You really need to get some advice in this area because it is fraught with danger. That'll take the emotional aspect out of it. There's a professional, there's an expert involved in that. They can guide you through it. There's constant reviews, there's tweaking. When your circumstances change, you can look at that as well too. But really, there's a lot in an investment strategy. And hopefully we've painted a fairly clear picture for everybody and what that entails and some of the things that we take our clients through when we're talking about that particular journey with people.
That was a big mouthful and big summaries.
I need to take a breath and a glass of water, I think.
Billy's face is all red after that one.
I wanted to get that out in one go. So
there's definitely a lot to unpack in this one, and sort of there's much more than what we're highlighting, and really just trying to touch on the basics and most important things, but really well summarized, Billy.
Beautiful. Andrew, thanks for your time today, as always. Always a pleasure.
Thank you, Billy. Always great. And thanks to everyone for listening. Really appreciate it.
We'll catch you next time.
Take care, guys.
Bye. Thanks for listening today. If you have any questions on what we talked about or would like to have a chat about your money journey, visit us at 360fs.com.au.
Just a reminder to our listeners that the information contained in this podcast is general in nature and it is not intended as personal recommendations for the audience. Please consider whether the information suits your circumstances before acting on it. This information is provided by Billy Amiridis and Andrew Nicolaou of 360 Financial Strategists Pty Ltd, authorised representatives and credit representatives of AMP Financial Planning.